the room, can I get a show of hands if the company that you're working on now, if you've raised any outside funding for that company? 1, 2, okay, so a few of us have. So would it be fair to say that it would be best to talk about how to approach, well, okay, so I think like my topic overall, to take a step back, was around fundraising, right? But I think when I think about fundraising, it's very different if you've already brought money in versus if you haven't brought money in. So is it fair to say that we should start like very early stage and think about how to make first approach for angels and so forth?
Yes.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Okay.
But don't miss the last part.
Okay. And then on that same topic, for those of you who have raised, can I get a sense of if it has been from angels or traditional VCs or friends and family, or if it's your own money?
Angels.
Angels?
My own money, and then the beginning of the crowdfunding campaign. We're $11,000 in.
Okay.
Congratulations. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great.
Great.
Friends and family. Okay. So for those of you who have not raised yet, assuming that there's a lot of like sweat equity is the term that you're putting in right now to get the company up and running. Okay. So I guess the other question that I would have is, probably not a question, I'm just thinking this through here to make sure that we're framing it up appropriately. I think let's talk about maybe friends and family versus angels versus crowdfunding for very early stage companies, and then talk about how to approach traditional VCs. Does that work?
Right.
Okay. So if we talk about friends and family, I think we're all familiar with what friends and family are, right? It's like a common frame. But I think that it's very commonly accepted, and there's a lot of sentiment in Silicon Valley from investors that friends and family rounds of somewhere between 0 to 500K are kind of like what get companies up and going. And there's a lot of problems with this assumption, mostly because most people in the world don't have friends and family members that just have 500K available to provide them for a high-risk endeavor. But unfortunately, it is kind of commonly expected. And so what we see at my firm quite a bit, I work at a firm called Backstage Capital. We've invested in about 100 companies, a little less than 100 companies, or a little fewer than 100 companies that are led by women, people of color, and LGBT founders. It is considered impact investing because we have a social impact by empowering these folks with capital. But in reality, we are just like called a pre-seed round. So this pre-seed round is this concept of I'm raising a small round of money, most likely 500K or less, but sometimes it could be 750K or less. And this pre-seed round is going to come in from angel investors who believe in what I've done so far and are willing to take a bet on me and help me get to the next level. And so we typically see, like with the founders that we've invested in, we've seen a high degree of success in this. What I've seen from them is that they generally raise anywhere between, on the low end, like 250K to 300K, on the high end, about 750K. And this is the critical money that helps them go from prototype to product to market, or it helps them go from developing the product to launching the product, like if it's a hardware product, for example. So once that money has been raised, then they're on the path. Then they're at the starting line with the people that have the friends and family money, if that makes sense. And then they're able to go and run and build, and the next step for them would be to raise a full-fledged seed round from more traditional VCs, which would be like us, or like your first round of capital, or your precursor ventures, or your rise of the rest, or whatever these other early stage funds are, to go then on and scale. So when it comes to, so then I think what's probably most helpful is to talk about angels. Like, how do you find angels? How do you build relationships with them? How do you vet them? What terms should you accept from them, and so forth? Would that be good?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. This is very good, and I like the interactivity. Okay, so there are a ton of angels out there. Like, there's so many of them, and typically you're probably already connected to many angels. I know you are if you're in this house right now in the Silicon Valley, but also like within your own networks, you're probably connected to angel investors. An angel investor needs to be an accredited investor. So are we all on the same page with what an accredited investor is? Okay, so an accredited investor, it's a definition from the government, meaning that it's kind of arbitrary. It's based on the level of income that the investor has, and it's that the investor, if they're single, has to have 200K a year in income plus $1 million in assets that it does not include their home. And if they're married, it needs to be 300K in income, and it's self-reported. So the reason why this is important is because the government is essentially saying people that are accredited investors have wealth of their own, and because they have wealth of their own, this is the part that's kind of questionable in my opinion, but they didn't ask me. Because they have wealth of their own, they understand that they should be managing the wealth in like a risk assessment. And so if they choose to invest in a high risk endeavor like a startup, a private startup, that is up to them. You do not want to ever be in a situation where you're taking money from an unaccredited investor unless you do a crowdfunding campaign, which is a really great alternative to an angel round. So accreditation is the first step when you're talking to angels. You always want to ask if people are accredited, and you can just Google this. It's linked. I think it's the SEC has a definition on their website. So if you're talking to a potential angel, just ask them like, hey, I'm just confirming that you're an accredited investor. Link to it. Get a yes or no. It's that simple. And this is to protect yourself as you go on to fundraise in the future, and also to make sure that you're talking to somebody that has some experience investing. The reason that's important is because while I just met all of you and I believe in all of you, it's going to be a really risky endeavor to build your business, and it's going to be tough for you to return the investment to these first investors that come in. In order for that to happen, you either have to IPO or have a merger or acquisition, right? So you want to make sure that you're really transparent with the investor from the beginning, that it's high risk, that there's a high probability they may never see their money. And the reason why that's important is because if they're not comfortable with that level of risk, that's not an investor that you want to have on your cap table, because you don't want somebody who invests in you and then 6 months later is like, hey, I haven't got my money back. And you're like, yo, I just built the software. Like I'm getting my first customer. That's just not a good vibe, right? So what I'm saying here all adds up to, when you're looking for angels, you're looking for people that are accredited, they're experienced, and a really good and tactical way that you can measure this experience is ask them who else they've invested in and then talk to those founders. So it could be the case sometimes that there's somebody that you have a really strong relationship with that believes in you and wants to give you money, and they have never invested in anybody else. That's one thing. But for the most part, you want to be talking to somebody that's invested in at least a handful of other companies, ideally more like 15 to 20 other companies. And the questions you ask them are things like, what do you expect from the companies you invest in? What kind of updates are you looking for? How much do you expect to be involved? Are you planning to, do you have reserved money in the future should I raise another round of funding and you want to maintain your same ownership percentage, that you might want to come on again? These are great questions that you should be asking them. They're going to diligence you, and you should diligence them in the same kind of capacity. And talking to the other founders, you want to ask them, how have these investors treated you? When you've hit rough patches in running your company, like you landed a customer and the customer left, how did the investor handle that? Or you had another scenario, with a co-founder or a first employee that went sour. How did the investor handle that? These dynamics, like these situations happen in every single startup, and in a seasoned and experienced investor is not going to stress out. Well, they might stress out a little depending on the scenario, but they shouldn't throw you for a loop or make it hard for you to run your company. And so those are the kinds of questions that you can ask these types of other companies that the angels have invested in to diligence them better. And then finally, I think it's a good idea to think about a ratio similar to a sales ratio in terms of closing an investment. So just like if anybody in here has a sales background, you can't close every single potential customer you talk to. Similarly, you're not going to close every potential investor. So think a good ratio is thinking like, I need to talk to 30 angels in order to get one to invest. And really great ways to find these angels are to look for angel networks. So there's groups like Band of Angels, Pipeline Angels, Silicon Valley Angels. I mean, there's tons of groups if you Google them. You can find a lot of them on AngelList. And then there's also lots of angel groups through universities or through companies. So Google, for example, has a ex-Google group called Zooglers, like ex-Google. And a lot of them are angel investors. And a lot of universities, even state schools or like public universities, have graduates that want to invest in companies that other alumni or other alums have started. So just look into, like, if you look into your LinkedIn, you'll be surprised. Most likely you'll be connected with people who are either angels themselves or well connected to angels. So that's kind of how you can find them, and keep the ratios in mind that from the initial conversations to the close, you'll probably have, it'll be at least 30-1 if you're lucky, could be as much as 100-1, depending on how, and that probably will be dependent on traction, most likely. And then the other thing on angels is, if you're targeting, let's say like 500K to 750K for your first like raise to get up and running, you probably want to set a minimum investment amount. And this is something that's kind of hard to think about, right? Because if you haven't raised money before, it sounds like a lot of money if you say like, hey, can you give me 50K to invest in my company, right? But if you're trying to raise 500K and you get 50 from somebody, that means you have to go find 9 other people to give you 50K too, right? Or even more than that, because I can't do math in my head and talk at the same time. a lot of people to give me 50K. So you might want to think like, maybe my minimum check amount should be 50, and the maximum I want from any one investor is 200. And think about like, how many people do I want having come in total and at what amounts? This is really helpful if you think about it before the conversation, because where you don't want to be is have an angel say, okay, I'm going to give you $5,000, and you're trying to raise 500,000, and you're like, ooh, what do I say? A good way to answer that is, oh, okay, our minimum is 25K. Like, is this negotiable? Can we meet in the middle? Or maybe this is not going to be a good match, right? These are ways, like, if you think about it in advance, then that way you have a good way to respond to that person. And the other thing to consider is the angel is bringing you money, but they also should be bringing you advice, network, strategic connections, etc. So maybe they're going to give you 5K and your minimum for anybody else would be 50, but they're a VP at a company that could be really valuable to you as a customer, or somebody that could be really valuable to you. It's your company. You get to decide who you're going to take on into your cap table, but it's important to kind of start thinking these things through before you get into the conversation. Note really quickly on crowdfunding. I love crowdfunding as an alternative for very early stage raises. I love equity crowdfunding, like what you're doing on WeFunder. Republic is another good option. But I also love crowdfunding like Kickstarter. So I'm looking at you have the clay, the smart clay. So like Kickstarter is a great program. Like there's a lot of ways, especially if you have a company, if you're working on something that you feel like a very big market can buy into. Like there's a lot of parents out there that have very complex logistical issues, right? So like lots of parents can buy in and invest in that and have a piece of that. I love that approach. And I haven't personally run a crowdfunding campaign. And as far as I know, our portfolio companies have not done one. I can't think of one that has done an equity crowdfunding. But this is a new area of fundraising opportunity that was only recently became available through legislation called the Jobs Act. Yeah. So you have an expert in your midst who's in the midst of it right now, and I would look into it as an alternative. Yeah. Okay. So that I think is a really good primer off the top of my head on friends and family, angels, and crowdfunding. Should we stop there for questions?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Thoughts? And then we can talk about later stage, how to transition from angels to institutional.
So it's 1:20 now, so yeah, now's a good time for some questions, and we can come back to you.
So what kind of information would the agent be looking for? What should we be ready with in approaching these agents?
Yeah, so there's really great information that's out there right now, actually. So I think like Broadway Angels and Band of Angels on their websites and Pipeline Angels all have an application process with outlined parameters.
Okay.
And they'll say, first of all, they'll say what sectors they're interested in. So this is helpful. Typically, angels invest in areas where they have domain expertise. But then they'll also talk about what they're looking for in terms of traction. So they'll say, we're looking to see if you have a prototype, an MVP, a product to market, if you have customers, if you have revenue, all of these different things. Mm-hmm. And if you just meet someone randomly, then I think the important thing to have on hand for any type of investor conversation or potential customer conversation is just some quick decks.
Okay.
And I'm assuming like that's part of this Women Startup Lab is going to give you resources around that. But you're just kind of like summarizing your business plan, right? What you're doing, why you're doing it, what the market is, who your team is, all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Good?
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions?
This is an easy one.
One, two, go first.
Can you define as far as stage of company for maybe some of the others in here who are late on the different levels of where you are as a business? Because I think when you mentioned prototyping and MVP or
Oh,
et cetera,
sure.
that some of that.
Sure. So in a software company, MVP meaning minimum viable product. So I don't want to say that that angels, and this goes to your question too, or any investors. Different investors have different levels of traction that they're looking for. Some investors will invest just based on an idea. It's really hard to find those people because ideas are very common. Most investors are looking for what you've done so far with your idea. And so the terms around that are like MVP, meaning minimum viable product. Prototype is typically more commonly used in hardware, but it might also be used in software. And then usually customer validation is really important too. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a product for sale and have customers, but there are other ways you can get customer validation. If you're solving your own problem, this is when it's really like it comes through. Like I remember talking to you when we had our pitch. Like if it's a problem that you feel like you've given up your life to solve this problem, then you have customer validation because it's your own thing. And if you can prove that it's not just you having this problem, then that's also really strong. But if you're not solving your own problem, that's also okay. You need to find the people you're solving the problem for and get their feedback to make sure that when you're developing that it's taken into consideration.
How does the equity work with angel investors?
Yeah, so they give you money and you give them a percentage of ownership in your company in exchange for that.
Generally, how much is that in such an early stage?
It really depends on what your company does, but typically, I would say just off the top of my mind, if you don't have something in market yet and there's just a couple people working on it, the valuations are typically around like $2 to $3 million, and you're raising somewhere between $250K to $500K. So I can't do math off the top of my head, like I said earlier, but that's like kind of similar what I see, and it's usually on safe notes or convertible notes that people raise from angels. There's some really good resources online about this. Y Combinator has some. Also, Brad Feld and Jason Middleton wrote a book called Venture Deals, which I highly recommend if you haven't read yet.
And then the angel version of that is Jason Calacanis' book.
Yes.
So he wrote a book called Angel.
Yep.
And so this is like the Brad Feld,
We have it
Jason
here.
Middleton equivalent for angels.
Yeah. So I would recommend those. It's really helpful to know what's motivating the investors before you have a conversation with them, because what's important to you and what's important to them is actually different. They need to make financial return and you need to grow a successful company. And while it seems like those things would be in parallel, they're not always. Other questions?
Yeah, how do they come up with the price? You say 2 to 3 million, what's the next stage? I know from a lot of YC companies, they evaluate the cap is like 10 million, 12 million, something like that. So
Yeah.
it depends on different size or traction, or how do they come up with that?
Yeah, so it's kind of like, so this is going to sound like a really weird analogy, but you know how you would price your house? If you're going to sell your house?
Demand?
Yeah, demand, comps, what's happening in the market in general. Like, for example, I have a house that's in Oakland and it's tiny. If my house were in Arkansas, I could probably only sell it for like $15,000 or $20,000. But because it's in Oakland, who knows? It's some crazy value. Y Combinator is kind of like that for startups. They do a lot to create scarcity for their companies and to drive the valuations up for the investment. What you want to be thinking about when it comes to valuation is you want to be thinking about a few things. You want to think about what dilution is most important for you as the founder, because the higher the price, the less you're diluted in your own ownership. But the higher the price, actually, it can be a hamstring for you, and you want to be really careful about not seeking a valuation that's too high. And here's the reason why. If you raise from an angel and then you go on to raise from an institutional VC, the next time you raise, it has to be at a higher valuation. And then the next time you raise again, it has to be at a higher valuation, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And the problem is, when you get to about a Series A or Series B, that's when you start dealing with firms that have very rigorous due diligence processes that take about 4 to 6 weeks. And those firms do significant amount of valuation analysis. And so let's say, for example, you raised a seed round at $10 million, and then it's time for your Series A. Well, if you don't have the traction to convince a Series A investor to value you at 18 million, and the Series A investor says, well, I think you're actually only worth $11 million right now, that's not good for your existing investors, because then they don't get to show the markup. So when it comes to evaluation and pricing, I think my recommendation is you want to be able to have room to grow, but you also want to be in a position that you feel as a founder that you are not being diluted too much. So anything under 2, I would avoid for anybody in this room. On your first raise, anything over 5 is probably a little bit too high, but I can't say that from how much I know you. I think you would really need to look at comps like other companies that are in your space and what they raised at. You can test with investors too. You can say, I'm thinking of raising 2 on 6, or 500 on 4, right? And if they're like, whoa, $4 million, how'd you come up with that? And you say, well, this is how I came up with it. I looked at these 3 other companies in the space. This is what I've done. And they're like, oh, actually, that makes sense. Then you have a sense of it, right? Similarly to how you appraise other investments.
Another question is about the syndicate.
Yeah.
Like, just like a group of angels and they do it together. So what's the pros and cons? Like, what would make your life easier if you go with the syndicate?
Yeah. Yeah, syndicate is really helpful. Jason does a lot of syndicates, Jason Calacanis, that you mentioned. Because essentially what a syndicate is it's one person who's saying, like, I found this deal, that one angel investor, and then they put it out to a group of people that come in and invest alongside of them. And so let's say that angel investor has the bandwidth to invest 25K of their own money, but they're able to gather 20 people who each put in anywhere from like 5 to 10K of their own. I don't know what the math is, but let's say that 25K that angel investor represented originally turns into 250 because they were able to gather other angels that came in with them. So that's great. That means you get more capital and they did the work for you, right? The things to ask are, how does this impact ownership percentage? So are there specific deal percentages that get impacted by that? And also, who is responsible for communicating with all those people? Is it that person that organized a syndicate, or are you now on the hook for sending information to 30 people that you've never met and don't have a relationship with? So that's what I would encourage in a syndicate. I'm a very big fan of syndicates. What I would encourage is transparency. Ask for expectations, and then also, similarly, like I said before, if you can find other people that have worked with that angel who have gone through a syndicate with them, and you can try to diligence that to see what their experience has been.
So is the syndicate leader is very important, like, make sure that person is reliable and take care of what he's going to take care of.
Yes.
Yeah.
How do you find out the valuation of your competitors?
Yeah, that's tough. It's not publicly available generally unless they've announced it themselves. So what I see though is that with companies that work, when you find your direct competitors, most likely at a very early stage, you only have maybe 1 or 2 that are competing directly with you. And you have a bunch of indirect competitors, a bunch of other people that are thinking about the idea, but not in the same way you are. If you're very well versed in your industry, you should be able to get a sense of it. And that's a very weird thing to say. It's like, I know a guy, but you can get a sense because you would probably know their employees, their customers, you can get a sense.
You can also back into how much they raised. I mean, you can look up how much they raised on Crunchbase and other places, and then you can back into it's probably around 10%, right? Was what they had to give up, and therefore the valuation was X.
Yeah, so you get a bunch of signals around it. Exactly.
You just triangulate
different pieces. Exactly.
So how comfortable are you willing to share your ideas when you're approaching the angels? Because there's some kind of you don't want other people to copy your ideas, that kind of thing.
Do you want to?
Nobody wants your ideas, so ideas are worth absolutely nothing. So just tell anybody and everybody who would listen. But as long as you're positioned as an investment, just make sure they're accredited. That is important. But you never ask people for an NDA. You never shy about the ideas because it's all about execution. Because, angels, especially the ones that invest a lot, I mean, they have heard every flavor of idea like about 100 times. So there's like absolutely nothing new under the sun that you can possibly pitch to them.
Okay.
So I would not be at all concerned about them like stealing your idea.
Yeah, an angel is not going to steal your idea. That's exactly right. Somebody that would steal your idea would be a competitor, right? So definitely you don't ask for an NDA. That's exactly the advice, because an investor is never going to send an NDA, and it sends a bad signal. It sends a signal that you're paranoid about them, which is kind of weird, but it's true. But what you can do is, if you have your deck together, which you want to have your deck together before you reach out to an investor, I recommend a tool called DocSend, where you can have your deck basically behind a wall where they have to enter their email address, and that shows you who accessed the deck before you get in the meeting. The other thing that's really interesting about that is kind of like a bit of a hack, if you will, is if you send them a DocSend link with your deck behind the link, and they have to enter their email address to get to the deck, and so you get an alert, you can see whether or not they looked at the deck before your meeting. So you can see whether or not they prepared for the meeting. And that puts you in a position of power in terms of understanding how much knowledge they already have versus what they don't know, right? So that's what I'd recommend. In terms of what you should be nervous about, I would be nervous about competitors, but you don't have any reason to be nervous about your ideas until you already have something ready, going and rolling.
Yeah, but DocSend is great because it literally tells you exactly how far in the deck they got,
Yeah.
like what page they stumbled on, how much they spend, literally how much time they spend on each slide.
Yeah,
I
I'm
mean,
probably
it's the best, investor intelligence tool ever.
Probably everybody that pitches me is like, this is the worst investor ever. Because our meeting is supposed to start at like 12:15, and they're like, Christie, access the deck at 12:15 and 22 seconds and spend 1 second per slide. And then I'll get on the call. Maybe that makes me a high achiever, I don't know.
You mentioned that you don't want to have too many or too few investors. What are the trade-offs between too few and too many?
Too few, then you can have people with outsized power, and you don't have enough trusted advisors, if you will. Too many, you have too many cooks in the kitchen, and everybody thinks that. That's why it's like important to diligence, right? So a great kind of like balance that I've seen with my portfolio is they'll have like something around 7 to 12 investors come in on a round of this size, and 2 or 3 of those people are people that love to be hands-on. They want to talk to the companies all the time. They want to know how the week is going. They want to know what obstacles will come up. Then 8 to 9 of the people are like, okay, go make me some money, go build, and let me know how I can help, right? That's a good vibe. What you don't want to have is 11 investors up in your grill, and the reason why is because most angel investors, I don't know if it's most, a lot of angel investors, I don't know what the percentage is of all of them, have never built a company from 0 to 1. They become wealthy for whatever reason. Maybe they worked at a company that IPO'd, maybe they have generational wealth, maybe they made their wealth in real estate. And so a lot of angel investors are not going to be able to give you really tactical and specific advice. A lot of them will be able to, not everybody will be able to. And so just because they invested doesn't mean they should necessarily be able to tell you how to run your company. And that's something that setting very good boundaries about that from an early stage is important, because it will save you a lot of grief. If you have people that don't know much about your industry or don't know much about your company trying to come in and tell you what to do, then it can set you on the wrong course.
How would you handle that?
Yeah.
Don't get.
It's actually really, it's like any relationship, the better expectation setting you do and the better boundary setting you do, the happier everybody is, right? So if you say to an angel, for example, thank you so much for your investment, this is what you can expect, or this is what you can expect when you invest. You can expect monthly updates from me on how the company is doing. You can expect me to reach out to you and ask for help. You can expect that when things are going well, I'll give you things that you can talk about with, because the angel investors, they're also motivated when they're out in the community, they want to talk about the wins that the companies have. They also want to feel like they're valuable beyond the check they wrote. So if you understand what motivates them, then you can kind of give them boundaries around those things, and then check, and you do a gut check. Some of them will be like, I want to talk to you every day. I don't want to talk to anybody every day, except for maybe my husband, and that's most days. Yeah.
We have one question in
Yeah.
particular I want to ask from our webinar people.
Sure.
Okay, the question is from an alum, the last batch, and
Okay.
she says, we are a bootstrapped startup and haven't been drawing a salary so far.
Yeah.
However, we are maintaining a list of how much the company owes us to date. How would this get addressed when we get our first round of funding?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Okay, so a follow-up question I would have is, how are you defining O's? Is that based on if you have been taking salary from the date you incorporated until today? So let me think about how to address this. So first of all, there's something in here in this question about finances, and I don't know who this company is or what their background is.
Yeah.
But you definitely want to have somebody helping you with finances even from the beginning, if this is not your background, like if you're not a CPA or a CFO by trade. You can find there's a lot of ways to outsource this. But the reason why I bring that up is because this concept of O's is really kind of a weighted concept. For example, if you're raising from angels and you're bringing in 500K and you tell the angels, I'm bringing in 500K in order to grow my business, like I've grown up to here and I want to launch it in these 3 new markets, but you don't tell them that you plan to spend 150 of that by paying yourself back, then that's not a good look. You need to be really transparent with how you plan to spend the capital. I have heard in later stage rounds of funding, like Series A and Series B funding, that capital will be earmarked for the founders because founders there's such a high opportunity cost of starting a company. A lot of times you can't take a salary at the beginning. If you do take a salary, it's not nearly comparable to what you'd be making at a big company. So, you may have been able to keep the lights on, but you haven't been investing in, retirement or whatever you would have been doing if you worked at the company. So a lot of times that can be handled in later stage rounds, but in very early stage rounds, it's really difficult because you're not bringing that much money in. Like I'm sure that this founder is very skilled and probably could have been earning at least 6 figures in whatever job they were working in. So it would be hard to say like, oh, I'm owed 300K and I'm going to raise 500, so I'm only going to have 200K to put back into the business. But you could say to the angels like, hey, out of 500K, 50K of that is earmarked to go to founders right away, and that's like a bonus, a supplemental bonus or something. And then the salary thing, I think a salary tip is to make your salary commensurate with the amount that you've raised, and you bring that into the investor conversation as well. When you get into later stage diligence, the diligencing people look at everybody's salary and they'll like make all kinds of judgments about it, and you just have to be ready for that. And like if you live in an area like the Bay Area and they ask you questions like, why are you paying yourself $225,000 a year? And you're like, do you know how much gas costs? And like, do you know what it costs to like feed myself? Like there's different things, but it's just something like ultimately if you're raising money from private investors, they're going to be the ones paying your salary. And so they have the right to ask the question. And that's something that you have to think about that speaks to a bigger thing, which is that when you bring in money from an outside investor, they have the right to ask you any question about how that money is spent. And so if you're in a position to bootstrap your company for a long time, then you're growing your company on your own terms and you're not answering to anybody else. That's kind of a really great position to be in, even if you don't get to grow as fast as you could with outside money.
Great.
Yeah, so I'm still looking for the right co-founders, and I was interviewing a data scientist last week who had said I need to be paid 200K up front, or I'm not coming on board. And I put my whole savings into this thing. And so I've heard some investors obviously want to see skin in the game and see that people put their own money in. But I'm also getting these demands, follow demand from some people in tech. And data scientists are in high demand obviously right now. So I'm struggling with, okay, what's going to look good for investors and what's a reasonable expectation for them.
What does your company do?
Yeah, so we're registries for people facing any illness that affects their clothing. So friends and extended family pay for the new clothing that they need.
Okay, so this is tough. So this is like a loaded question, right? Because you're asking a lot of things at one time, which is like, I want to recruit somebody that can get paid a lot of money, right? But then there's also like the co-founder thing. How do you decide who becomes a co-founder? And that's like a whole different thing from a first hire or early hire. Just specifically on data science and skill set, what I have found is that there are specific roles that are very competitive, data science being one, like a machine learning engineer, right? Google and Facebook are paying as much as $1 million or more to hire these people. So the question is, if you need that skill set at the scale that your company is. And I'll give you an example. The reason why Google and Facebook are paying $1 million is because they're hiring these people to go through data sets that are like gigantic and take these insights out and put them into their software, right? If your data set isn't that big yet, then that data scientist may not have they may not have the application to work on to leverage their skill set. Separately though, there's a difference between having a data science skill set and having somebody that gels with you that could be your co-founder. Like, that's a whole different set of terms, right? Mm-hmm. And what I've seen is, especially in the Bay Area, like for example, one of my portfolio companies last week, I had this call with the CEO and he's like, oh yeah, we're hiring this person and I'm planning to offer 160. And I was like, oh, that's kind of high based on what you've raised. And then, so I was asking more questions, right, before I jumped to conclusions. And it turns out that this person was earning 600K. And so it was going from 600K to being offered 160. I was like, all right, well, now that you've put that into context and you expect that the value that they're going to be bringing in is probably much higher than that 160, now I feel better about it as an investor, right? With a co-founder needs to be ride or die in the same sense that you are towards the company. And so it is really hard, it's really hard because you wouldn't like go into a networking event to kind of find a co-founder, or when you go up to somebody and be like, hey, do you want to work for no dollars? Put your life savings into this thing that might fail. Work for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week for the next 5 years and give up your life and whatever else you could have done at that time and maybe it won't work out. Like, how does that sound?
Great deal.
Yeah, let's sign on the line. Yeah. But so I think specifically with co-founders, we have multiple companies in our portfolio that are single founders, and actually one of them recently was speaking to some earlier stage companies, and he said that was one of his biggest regrets, was being a single founder, because he felt that when it was really tough, he had nobody to help him shoulder the burden. And I think, he came through that, and now the company is doing relatively well and it's scaling. So not every company finds a co-founder, but I think if you can find that person that you trust, it's it's a huge benefit. But and I don't want to infantilize or familiarize a co-founder to say that they're like a member of your family, but I think it's that level of trust, right?
It's a big deal.
Yeah, it's a big deal. So I think just like you wouldn't marry somebody that you met on a first date, you want to give yourself a lot of time to get to know the person and a lot of time to see how your skill set benefits their skill set, and then also plan to set aside some money and some time for co-founder therapy with business coaches or something to that effect. And if you don't have a business coach yourself, I also would highly recommend it. It's usually not that expensive, and it can make a big difference in your perspective, and just understanding that even when the going is really rough, you're not the only one that's been there, and there's all these ways that you can work through it, and you're going to get somewhere positive. And that's really hard to do if you're not making payroll, for example. Those moments can feel really stressful.
That's really helpful. I didn't move forward with him because I was thinking, okay, what are the last ones to get paid?
Yeah.
That needs to be the expectation going forward. But it's been in the back of my mind because he said any investor will want me on board for 200K. And I thought,
that's not true.
Okay, that's why I moved forward with them.
That's a great negotiating tactic, though. May we all talk about ourselves like this guy talked about himself.
I know.
Yeah.
So I didn't move forward with them.
Yeah, that was a good move, I think.
So coming back to the question of co-founder, I don't have a co-founder, and yes, it is hard. There's a lot of critical decisions that I make, and sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong, and it's wrong maybe a few weeks later.
Yeah.
So that part is true, but how difficult does it take when it comes to raising funds that I don't have a co-founder?
Yeah, so different investors feel different ways about it. I don't really think, for us, it doesn't matter, but we also are very, I think, human is how we get described a lot, and a lot of other investors seem to make these arbitrary rules that don't make sense to me. So for example, what I'm saying is 10% of our portfolio, the co-founders are family. They're either married to each other, mother and child, or siblings, and other investors are like, oh, I would never invest in a married couple. And I'm like, why? Like, they're productive all the time. Like, you know they never stop working, right? I don't know if that's productive, actually. But I'm just being facetious. But yeah, I think you can raise money without a co-founder. I think that if you find an investor that doesn't want to invest because you don't have a co-founder, they're probably not a good fit anyways. Yeah.
Most VCs do not invest in solo founders, just as a matter of principle. Some of them literally put it on there.
Yeah.
Like,
But by the time we come to the VC level, you know.
For
that-
angels, you might be.
Yeah, because the company would be big enough, but then you could think at VC level. But at this stage where they're looking for base, you know, as you said, you know, early stage up to 750K.
Yeah, I think
have they
you're,
hired enough people to make the company completely be rounded in that stage. So
yeah, I think you're okay not having a co-founder. But I think it's something you should really think about. And you can bring one on. So that's also kind of weird. Like, co-founder implies that the person is there since the founding, like since the birth of the company. But sometimes you can bring a co-founder on
at a later stage,
yeah.
you know, in 3-4 months down the line, then
Right.
yeah.
Or you can call like the executive team, the leadership team. Like, there's a lot of.
I was going to call it as the founding team, you know,
Yeah,
the first
that's
team or something like that.
Yep.
And you have 3 or 4 people in, that makes it sound like different. And it's true too, because as you rightly pointed out, at this stage, I don't have someone who's like long-term relationship, friendship, whom I've had the mental mind connect on the topic.
Right.
So anybody I bring in is going to be someone who's going to have to believe, trust, all of that. Yeah. Right? So it's that gate is already shut. So I have to relook at the first team. So that's why.
Okay, that's good. Also, on a note on the VCs that say they won't invest in teams that don't have co-founders, or they say they won't invest in solo founders, you can always find a company with a solo founder that's in their portfolio.
Yes.
That's another thing. VCs always say this is my investment thesis, and I only invest in that thesis. And then you're like, so why is that company in your portfolio? And the reason is usually because it's either the exception that proves the rule, like they invested and then realized the mistake that they made, and then that's what helped them inform, or it's that they are, I just lost my train of thought. It's exception that proves the rule, or
That will make an exception for the right company. So
yeah,
yes,
or
in general, they
relationship
prefer to
based.
invest in
Yeah.
2+ co-founders, but if they see an absolutely kick-ass company that they must invest in,
Yeah,
that
like
will
maybe
go.
they've known that founder for decades, or there's some other mitigating factor that overrode their thesis.
Can we talk about the next stage?
Yeah,
Because we've got 7 minutes.
good.
Yeah.
Okay, so you raised some angels. Now you're going to go out for your first institutional VC round of funding, right? Really great way to accelerate this is to look at programs like Techstars or Y Combinator or other accelerator programs. They're really helpful in helping you move up the ladder from angels to institutional VCs, and they also have a lot of online content available too. So then I think, so the book I mentioned earlier about venture deals by Brad Feld and Jason Middleton, super helpful. The next thing there is to start looking for firms that can back you. And this is where you want to be super detailed in your research and spend a lot of time thinking about what kind of firms do you want to have on your cap table. And you can, there are a lot of ways to strategize around this, and fundraising strategy at the seed stage level. You could spend weeks just thinking about who to approach, right? So quickly though, since we have 10 minutes, you probably have angels invested already that are willing to come in and maybe upgrade their investment, right? So let's say you're going to go out for a seed round of 1.25 million. Think about that 250K as people that have already invested in you that are either going to come in and add more, or they're going to bring people from their network to come in and add more, right? So there's a bucket of that should be taken care of by people that have already invested in you. Now you have another $1 million to raise, right? So in a similar sense as what we talked about with angels, okay, so if you have $1 million, that means the biggest allocation that you can probably give to any one investor is somewhere between 250 and 500. So who can write a check between 250 and 500? So then once you find out which firms those are, then you kind of have to start diligencing them further to understand what are their motivations. How many checks a year do they write? So this is like a really important question, because a lot of firms will say, that they're early stage investors, but they only invest in 10 companies a year. That means less than 1 a month. So you just have to think that these percentages are really low. And especially at this stage of funding, there's a lot of companies out there that have raised from angels and haven't yet raised from seed. or haven't raised their full seed round yet. So understanding which firms are the right fit is the first start, and then getting a warm introduction to those firms is the second start. I would say give yourself at least 6 months to raise a seed round, and that's a conservative estimate. If you have relationships already with investors, 3 to 6 months, 3 months being the absolute fastest it'll go. If you don't have relationships yet, give yourself 6 months to start working on those relationships, and then start a raise and give yourself 6 months to close it. And then I think the last thing is when it comes to the investors, like which investors come in, similar to what I said about diligencing angels, you want to diligence the investors that are talking to you, and you want to diligence the partner that works on your deal. Because at the seed stage, it's not as common that partners take board roles, but sometimes it happens. But you want to find out, who is this person? Are they going to be helpful to me? They're going to pick up the phone when I call them? How is the firm going to help me out? Like, get a sense of all of that kind of stuff. And there's actually, I don't know if this is still available or not online, but the Venture Deals book that I've been talking about, they do an online class as well. And it's free class that you can take, and it's really helpful because it's a 6-week program, and each week is like, how do you take your company through the investment process? And you talk, and it goes through, and you actually get graded by associates that work in the Foundry Group under Brad Feld. So the associates will give you feedback and tips on the fundraising process.
Right. So is there any difference really between the different types of investors?
Yes.
And what kind of terms and conditions you would enter in, or what the expectations would be? Can you highlight those?
So here's the major difference.
Okay.
Angels are investing their own money. So if they lose their money, they have to answer to themselves, right? VCs are investing other people's money.
Okay.
So if they lose that money, they lose their job. Theoretically, it doesn't always happen, but that's like a major difference there. So when you're talking to a partner at a VC firm, he's part of a group of people that are going to make the decision. When you're talking to the angel can make the decision themselves, and that's the difference in the dynamics. So when you're planning to raise from a VC firm, you have to think about, how do I get all the, you can ask questions like, do all the partners have to come on board in order for me to get the investment? How long does it take? Is there a deal memo? Should I come pitch to all the partners? Like, you need to ask the question about the process, because it'll be different from angels who can, an angel can take a meeting and write you a check at the end of the meeting. It doesn't always happen because it's kind of cool right? Yeah.
So for accelerators or VCs, do they assume they do invest in companies with similar ideas? And when they do, how does the dynamic work?
You need to talk to the accelerator. So it depends. For us, we have companies that are in the same sector, and some of those companies, as they grow, probably will go to be competitors. But right now, they're in different areas of that sector. And so we put protections in place to make sure those companies understand that different partners are talking to them, and that their information is not getting to the other companies. Yeah. But with an accelerator program like Techstars, they have had hundreds of companies go through, and they probably have a process, I would imagine. With other smaller accelerators, it may not be as formalized, so you want to diligence that with the accelerator itself.
We have some potential investors in China, and I'm just really interested how that might impact our fundraising in the US, how it's perceived.
I think it wouldn't be, it's hard to say. But I think that if you have like investors that are going to give you a significant amount of capital, like they come in and you don't have to raise from investors in the US right away, then I think it'll be great. Because then it's like you come in the room and you're like, look what I've done. You didn't even have to come to the table yet to help me out. I've done all this, right? And China's a huge market. Asia is a huge market. You could be successful there without ever raising from investors here.
One of our batchmates, though, had a bad experience with Chinese investors, in that apparently something about regulations changed in China about what they can invest in terms of American companies. And so she ended up having conversations that didn't go anywhere. So they still take the conversations, but they are actually not able to write the checks because of apparently some change on the Chinese side.
Okay.
Right. In terms of what they can actually do in terms of investment here in the US. Just be aware of that.
Yeah.
But overall, as a foreign, being a Delaware C corporation, probably 90% of our investors are angels coming out of Australia, but we're a Delaware corporation, and because of that, that kind of also bypasses the qualified accredited investor terms because it's offshore money. So that's one of the upsides of bringing in foreign money to back your startup here.
Okay, so one more question.
I think, well, does anyone have anything else? Otherwise, I know, Christy, you have a phone call.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we're going to end
How
here.
can we reach out to you?
Yes.
Christie at backstagecapital.com. If you're going to reach out to pitch me, I would advise against it at the moment because we are in the midst of in between a couple of funds, so I don't have anything to invest. But we do have a deal flow team that's looking at companies for when we do come back into investment, and that's Brittany Davis, and her first name is on our website. It's Backstage Capital. She's Brittany, Brittany. You could reach out to her directly, and she'd be happy to talk to you. We also have an open application process. The deal flow team reviews all these applications. And we have podcasts, and we have all kinds of stuff, so check out our website.
Great.
We never stop working for you, friends.
And then we want to do one photo, if you can, really quick.
Yeah, let's do it.
You guys all want to get together. Oh, actually, stay where you are, and then I'll have her come this way.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Christy.
Yeah, thank you.
And then everyone, well,
Thank you for having me.
okay, and then while we grab that announcement, so on Friday, Startup World Cup, we have promo codes for everyone, 80% off tickets, and then we want to bring some of you as our guests. So I'll let you know about that, so stay. And then the accelerator, we're taking rolling applications for end of July. And so we can ask any questions, take any questions about that.
Oh, cool.
Great. Okay, thanks, Sam. I'll take a couple. Oh, this looks great.
Yay.
Woohoo! Thanks.
Awesome.
Looking good.
Yeah.
Looking good.
I'll bring you back again. And then you can come back out.
Yeah, I'll be back up to my phone.
Yes.
Thank you. I know. When you are talking to teachers,